Vedas Plant Shop is owned and operated by Jeff Vedas, a fourth-generation grower and horticulturalist who vividly recalls growing up as a young child at his great-grandparents' greenhouse in central Illinois. Vedas Flower Shop and Greenhouse founded in 1951. Jeff opened the Vedas Plant Shop in 2020 and grows many of the plants that he sells in his greenhouse. The shop has one of the largest variety of tropical plants in the city of Chicago, and while they may have only one or two of a species, that gives them the ability to carry more variety in a small space. He says that while he may have a lot of knowledge about plants and what they need to stay healthy, there are always new things to learn and surprises along the way. Jeff enjoys teaching and readily shares plant care tips with anyone that asks. Thank you, Jeff, for sharing your expertise on this subject with the DePaul community.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here, and thank you all for being here. I have been told in the past that I speak a little fast sometimes, so I'm going to try to make a concerted effort here to slowly speak today, because I know that there's a lot of people and a lot of new plant parents and a lot of interest in actually learning these things. So I hope that I can share some knowledge and wisdom with you guys. Thank you to everybody that has submitted questions in advance. That gave me a lot of direction on what to talk about today. So without wasting any other time, I'm going to jump right in. Let's see, where do we start? So the first question that somebody asked is, how do you know when your plant is sick, has root rot, or needs new soil? So that's a fun question. That's a good question. And I think it's probably one of the most common questions that we get at the plant shop. And it should be simple with a simple answer, but it's not. There's really multiple ways to know these things. And there are a few key indicators that something is wrong, though. And what you can do to catch them or to know them and help prevent them are about 3 steps, really. So I would say the first thing to do is learn about your plant variety, learn about the species, learn where it grows natively, what its environment is like, and try to replicate that as closely as possible. Most people don't really think about this too much, but your common tropical houseplants like Pothos, for example, one of the easiest, most common plants, grows really well in Florida and like southern states and Central and South America, but it's 80 to 90 degrees all year down there. It's 80 to 90% humidity, and then we try to replicate that in our house in a Chicago winter or in our dark garden apartment, and it can be stressful on the plant. So what you can do, all you can do is just try to give it as close of an environment as possible. So that's what that's going to do, is limit the stress that's going to have from not being in its own environment. And that stress can lead to a number of problems like they become less disease resistant. They become more attractive to pests. They just get unhealthy in general. So that's gonna help limit that. The second thing you can do is provide. So provide what your plants need. So more moisture, less moisture, more light, less light, and so forth. Nutrients, if they need nutrients, then these are all things that can be fairly easy to learn, from species to species, what your plant needs. And by looking online, just Googling them, because they're all a little bit different. There's kind of some general guidelines for plants, for house plants and what they need. But like this tree, for example, it doesn't need the same things that this snake plant needs. Okay. So snake plants are probably one of the most laid back, easygoing plants there are. Somebody did a study on these and they put them in a dark room, and I think it lived for 90 or 100 days with 0 light. Now this tree would have lost all of its leaves within that 90 days and probably died. Because if you think about where things grow, like in the hierarchy of, in the desert, you'll have low ground hugging plants like cacti, succulents. Those plants don't have anything tall around them usually. So they're getting that sunlight all day, just blasting on them. So that plant and trees, there's nothing above trees in the forest. So those things need all day sun because there's nothing blocking that sun from them. Then there's plants like Pothos. These are a vine. They're gonna be found growing up the tree trunk in the forest. They're getting dappled or filtered light. Same thing with philodendrons. So they need less light. So knowing how they grow in their native land or their native homes and what kind of environment, those are all important for that reason. Let's see. So I mentioned earlier about learning from like Google search. Just keep in mind that not everything that you read online is accurate. There's a lot of bad plant advice on several platforms. Like TikTok is a big one right now, where I see a lot of interesting theories that, shake your fiddly fig when you walk by it and it'll make it happier and healthier. It doesn't really need it. If you have a fan or if you go by it and it gets a draft, that's going to replicate the breeze. But anyway, just an example of stuff online that's not always good advice. So consider the source and just make sure that it is a reputable one. So the next thing that you can do for your plant to know when it's sick or has root rot or is telling you something is pay attention. So a lot of people say that you can listen to your plant, or it's listen with your eyes, basically. If you're paying attention to your plants and you walk by it and every day it looks like, hey, it's got 8 leaves and they're green. And then the next day you walk by and there's 8 leaves and only half of them are green, or one of them's yellow or whatever. That would be an indicator of maybe it's time to look a little closer. Does it have pests? Did it get too much water? Did it not get enough water? Their plants are more than just a pretty piece of decoration for a corner of your home. And depending on the plant, some of them are just as much responsibility as children, and sometimes even more. But educating yourself about the needs of your plant and committing to fulfill those needs for that plant is really the best way to be a successful plant parent. One example I like to use at the shop when people ask is your lifestyle. So say that you travel frequently, whether for work or pleasure, but if you're going to be away from home fairly regularly for a couple weeks at a time, unless you're prepared to hire a plant sitter or have a friend come by and check in on the plants, then you'll need to probably buy very hardy plants or heavy duty plants like snake plants, like ZZ plant. This is another plant of steel, they sometimes call them. Doesn't need much water, maybe once a month at most. But plants like those are great for somebody that's not going to be at home a lot, spending a lot of time with their plants, and being able to monitor them and giving them moisture or water, rather. If that was your lifestyle and you did have a bunch of fancy plants, then you might be prepared to come home to dead or sickly plants. So that's one thing to keep in mind is don't out plant yourself, I guess, or be prepared to hire a plant sitter when you leave town. Let's see. What's another question? Oh, one thing I wanted to add is keep in mind that for hundreds of millions of years, plants have been doing really just fine on their own without any intervention from us. So that's in their native habitats. Since we've taken them out of those habitats and into our homes, we will need to provide just a few basic things for them since they don't have, their own access to them. Things are water, nutrients, light, and environmentals like temperature and humidity. And then paying attention to the signs. So usually if there's signs showing that the plant, if it's got a yellow leaf or it's losing leaves, or, if it's just looking dead, for example, like this guy here, we'll get to this later. Something's going wrong with it. It could be pests, it could be overwatered, it could be underwatered. It's obviously there's something wrong. It might not be the right location, too much light, not enough light, too hot, too cold. So there's a lot of things to learn. And as Rachel said in the beginning, I'm always still learning things because I like to experiment with, plants and try different things just to kind of see it. I think that helps me learn more so I can share that knowledge more with others. All right. So the next question So the next question, somebody asked, how do you determine how much water and fertilizer is necessary? So I don't want to sound like a broken record, but again, it's going to be different from plant to plant. So you want to know, have a working knowledge of your plant, the variety that you've got and what its needs are. But as a general purpose, a general answer for your common house plants, you should water it when it's dry, and you should fertilize it fairly regularly during its growing season. So by growing season, for most plants that we have, it's going to be spring through summer. So when the days are longer, they're getting more light, the temperature is warmer. That's when that plant does its growth, most of its growing. Now, because it's growing, that's why it needs the extra nutrients to support that growth. If it doesn't get them, then it could lead to the things I mentioned earlier, less disease resistance, less pest resistance, and even eventually death. So find out what your plant needs. And it's going to vary quite a bit from plant to plant. For example, a banana tree, which we have a banana tree with huge leaves. They're a very fast growing tree, and they need an extremely heavy nutrient load as it grows. That's going to help it keep up with producing these huge broad leaves, and then flowers and fruit eventually. Another example on the other end of the spectrum are plants like carnivorous plants, Venus flytraps, sundews, pitcher plants, and so forth. Those are plants that that shouldn't be fed plant food or nutrients. They're used to living in a bog environment, in a very poor nutrient soil. It's usually just a bog. So they get their nutrients from the organisms that they catch and consume. Let's see. So what's the next question? One thing to add to that, some people still give their plants, their bog plants and their carnivorous plants nutrients, and they'll find that it's going to burn them and often kill them because they're not equipped to handle, those nutrients like that. A lot of normal houseplants in general, if you use the instructions on the label of nutrients, like the yellow bottle of stuff that we won't mention any brand names, but it's almost always recommended to use about a half of the dosage that they recommend on the container. They recommend using this massive amount, and for some plants, it's great and it'll work fine. But for others, it can burn them. You'll have spotting on the leaves, yellowing, browning, losing leaves altogether. So just go easy if you're going to use those kind of fertilizers. I recommend using worm castings. It looks like dirt. Basically what it is it's worm excrement, and it is harvested from worm farms, and it's just extremely rich, nutrient rich black soil essentially. And basically what you do, I don't know if you can see this here. Yep. Basically what you do is you sprinkle about a 1/4 inch layer of this on the surface of the plant, on the soil. So just like here. And then every time you water that plant, it's going to release those nutrients into it, and the roots will absorb it. That's a nice slow release fertilizer. And then if you want something that's more of an instant gratification, it's going to be the fish fertilizer is what we like to use. That is basically just fish byproducts from like the fish processing plant. It smells a little fishy, but you're just going to use somewhere between 1 and 3 tablespoons per gallon of water. So 1 tablespoon of the fish emulsion into a jug with a gallon of water. And you can use that every time you water the plant if you wish. If you want to use it less frequently, you can use 2 to 3 tablespoons per gallon of water, and then do it every other time or once a month, and that sort of thing. That is more of an instant gratification food, and they're both rich in nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, not sodium. They're going to give the plants the nutrients that they need, nutrients and micronutrients. One other thing to keep in mind is just remember to find out your plant's specific nutrient needs and don't overdo it. And don't, it's probably definitely better to underdo it than to overdo it, because the nutrients can be as bad for them as they can be good for them if used incorrectly. Okay, next question is, when should you change your plant's location? So this, I have to say, is probably my favorite question for this whole webinar. And the answer is something that people at the shop hear me say quite a bit. And that is, in the wild, a plant almost never picks up and is moved to another location. So when we do this to them in our homes, it's very shocking to them. It's stressful. Some plants can, the Fiddly Fig, for example, and all the ficus family, all the ficus trees are a little bit more sensitive to movement and environmental changes than some of the other plants. You would think a tree would be pretty tough and heavy duty, but this guy can be pretty sensitive. If you move a fig tree from one end of the house to the other and say that the light is, it's getting less light, or it's by a draft, by a vent, it can be tough on the tree, and you should expect it to lose some of its leaves. They'll start by turning yellow and then they'll just fall off. This one was recently brought in here. We can probably get it to lose a leaf or two just by a little shake there. So I've only had it in here for about 2 or 3 weeks. So it's still adjusting. So I guess to get back to the real question here is, when should you change the plant's location? The answer is, if your plant looks good and it seems to be thriving, don't change the location. There's exceptions, of course. One exception being when the seasons change. If you have a plant that you've got in the window, absorbing all of that sunshine, and then winter comes along and that's going to be a cold spot in that window, then it might be a good idea to pull them back from the window, because a lot of plants don't like drafts, cold drafts especially. If a plant is in a spot in your home now and it doesn't look to be thriving or doing well, that might be a time to change its location. There's probably, there's multiple reasons it could be looking poorly, but if we go back to, again, the root of the problem here is, what does it need? And are you providing that for it? Then that's gonna help you determine. So in short, I guess, you shouldn't move your plant to a new location if it's healthy and it's thriving. Another thing, I guess, to keep in mind is, if you go from one spot, like if, say, your tree is by the window in the winter and it's been happy and thriving, but summer comes along and there's an air conditioning vent right above it, you want to move it a little bit just so it's not getting that cold draft. A cold draft of air blowing on a tree can be just as bad as like a hot draft of air from a furnace vent. So just keeping an eye on it, and slow movements if you need to move it away from something. Next question. How do I know when I need to repot? That's a good question. It's another one that doesn't have necessarily a black and white answer for every plant, but I would say in general, most people probably want to repot their plants more than they need. It's kind of like the watering thing. In our head, for whatever reason, we associate caring for the plant to giving it water or picking it out of its pot and putting it in another. And it's not caring for it. It's pretty stressful to them unless they need it. So when do you know if it needs it? Let's see if we've got an example plant here. Yeah, so this guy here, I was looking at this fern. It's an bird's nest fern earlier. And I thought, well, this would be a good example for people to know when a plant is root bound and needs repotted. So this slid right out of its pot, which is good, but it's just a solid mass of all these roots. And it's very hard, very firm. So this probably should have been repotted some time ago, but it didn't get it. So now it'll be fine. It might be a little more stressful for it when I do repot it, but we'll have to cut it a little bit, loosen up the roots. with a knife, or, you can use like a chopstick or something like that to go in and sort of gently prod them apart. They sort of grow into each other. So let me back up. I guess, when do you know when it's time to repot? If your plant if you haven't changed anything, your care for the plant, you haven't stopped watering it or started watering it more, you haven't moved it, nothing around it's changed, but it looks different or it looks to be struggling, you want to take a look at it, check it out. It might be a sign that it needs repotted. Many plants prefer to be in a tighter pot, with less soil. And the main reason for that is because people are overwaterers. If you have a great big pot of soil and a little plant in it, there's going to be more soil that's holding potentially more water, which can lead to more issues because plants don't like sitting in wet soil in general. Some plants, though, need extra room, primarily plants that are top heavy, just because they have a big, heavy root system that helps keep them upright. So backing up, I guess, got ahead of myself. If your plant if you haven't changed anything you're doing to your plant, but it's changing in appearance, check it. Check the soil. Is it fresh? Has it recently been repotted? If yes, then it probably doesn't need it again. I would say, in general rule of thumb, it's going to be once a year. Some plants every 2 or 3 years. If you've got something that you got in an extra small pot to begin with, and it had a good growing season, maybe you'll need to do it every couple of 6 months or 8 months. But in general, we repot more than we should. Now, I repot a lot, but that's because I grow things. And there's a right way to do it if you need to do it. I know sometimes we feel compelled to water or repot or tend to our plants. The right way to do it is to be gentle with it and go, you'd always want to go like just one size up. You don't want to go from from this little pot here into this giant pot here. That's overkill. That's too much. The plant won't know what to do with itself, and you'll overwater it. I can almost guarantee it. So stay within a couple sizes, 1 or 2 inches up in pot size, and gently take it out of the pot. You may have to loosen it, but just by giving it a squeeze on all sides, that loosens the roots that are sticking to the inside of the pot. The holes in the bottom can be handy for more than just drainage. You can stick like your chopstick or whatever in there, just to give them a little nudge, and loosens everything from the bottom as well. And then once you've done that, if it's not like a rock hard mass, you just kind of loosen it a bit, just lightly with your fingers. And then you have the new pot, the next size up, where you've put just about 1/3 of the way full of the new soil. And if you can, you want to sort of make a well with that soil so that the existing root ball can just drop right into it. And then once it's in there, you don't pack it down. It's always wanted to be fluffy soil. You want to keep the soil light so that the roots can continue to grow into it without much effort. So once you've dropped the plant in and its root ball in, you can just fill around the edges with the extra, more soil, and don't pack it in. Just remember, keep it light and fluffy. So fill it and then water it to settle in the soil. They also call that watering it in. And that's it. That's it. Nothing else to do to fuss with it, unless it was, severely root bound. So that's when. One other thing. Some plants, like the ZZ, for example, these guys have a different type of root than most plants, and it sort of looks like a potato. It's called a rhizome, and they're notorious for like busting out of the pot. So one thing you'll notice with these plants, you'll know when it's time to repot, because the pot is either like elongated from the rhizome stretching it out, or it's actually cracked it open. And I've seen these crack open ceramic terracotta pots before. So it's pretty common. They're pretty tough. I don't know if you can really get this angle here, but you can see the bit of the rhizome right here. It looks literally just like a potato. Those are strong, and it'll tell you when it's time to repot it. So that's another thing to notice is if you go up to your pot and you can go up to your plant, if you can squeeze the pot and if it has give, it's not root bound. Another time to repot a plant would be when if you've waterlogged it, if it's waterlogged and there's root rot, if there's a pest infestation, and then that would be a good reason to repot it, because you want to get rid of all that soil, because that's where pests generally lay their eggs. So yeah, if you need to snip off dead roots, that's it really for when it's time to repot a plant. Okay, so this next one is an interesting question. This is kind of a common one. So someone asked, how do you avoid shocking delicate tropical plants when you move them into a new environment? Like if you move your home and you take your plants with you. So that's a tricky one. There are plants that you cannot avoid shocking by moving them. And they're going to be the more delicate plants, like the ones that you have in your IKEA greenhouse cabinet. I don't know if you all know what those are, but they're very popular and trendy right now. It's like a glass cabinet, and the people are retrofitting them. They're like sealing up the edges and corners with weather stripping and putting in humidifiers and fans in them and making it essentially like a small greenhouse to keep your rare or your humidity needing plants in, and be able to see them and enjoy them without letting them die. So some of those plants, they're going to respond differently than your ZZs and your snake plants and your pothos to a move. So I did it. I moved about 350 plants into this shop in October, and it was the worst 2 weeks of my life, possibly. And basically what I did was I just put them all in plastic totes, the great big Rubbermaid containers. The ones that were more sensitive, I put in with wet or damp sphagnum moss just to keep the moist air in that tote, and stuck them in the car and drove trip after trip over here and unloaded them into as ideal an environment as possible, or as close to where they're coming from. So if you're moving from your 80-degree home with south-facing windows and that's where all your plants are, you want to try to replicate that as closely as possible. You want to avoid as much, bumps and juggling around of the plants as possible, because that's stressful to them. You don't want to give them to the movers. Some moving companies won't even do it, but I would avoid it anyway. Keep them with you, do them yourself, package them yourself. You can do the paper sleeves where you just take the brown craft paper and make them into cones, and then you just drop the plant into the cone and then fold over the top. That's a good way to sort of haul them around and protect their leaves. Let's see. You just want to make it as stress-free a transition for them as possible. So try and go from A to A, not from A to Z, So if you're moving across country, that can be a tough one. You probably will have to go with the movers. If you do, you can, if you're putting them in boxes, you want to fill voids with packing peanuts or like that polyfill material, just to keep them from jostling around as much as possible. So before you move them, and then after, again, there's this stuff you can spray them with, just a little spray bottle of stuff that it's called Super Thrive. Basically what it is just nutrients and vitamins for the plant, and it'll help them de-stress. You can use it when you repot them. So it can assist and minimize the stress and speed up recovery. So do that before you move them, and then after. As I mentioned earlier, some plants like the Fiddly Fig or other ficus trees are just notorious for throwing leaves as they're in shock. So you should just probably assume that you'll lose a few leaves if you move those plants. But again, just minimize the stress to them and keep them as comfortable as possible. One thing about fiddle leaves is the older the tree, strangely enough, the more sensitive they are. So if we have a little ficus tree like this, it won't think anything of it. But these big ones, and you can't see this right now, but there's a 12-foot tall ficus tree in here. Let's see. That guy, when I moved it into this shop, it lost probably about 75% of its leaves. So that was shocking to me and it. Um, it came from outside to inside. So I had to give it a lot more light and, just kind of baby it along. And it was about 3 months before it stopped losing leaves, but it's alive, it's putting out new growth, and it made it. So they'll all usually recover. Just got to give them the extra love. Let's see. Sometimes you might want to consider it's a big move and you have a lot of plants, maybe it's going to be easier to sell some or give some away. The ones that you're not entirely in love with. And then that gives you another reason to shop for new plants at your new place. Let's see, the next question. How to repot. That's a big one. Let's talk about it. How to repot. So the question was how to repot and separate fiddle leaf fig. So this question can apply to most any larger house plant. And again, I would say that it's not always a black and white answer, but it can be tough. So here at the shop, we offer that as a service because a lot of people do come in and ask, hey, do you have any tips for how to repot my plant? And they're terrified because they don't want to hurt it and they know that it needs repotted. So we do offer that as a service because we've got some experience doing it, but it helps to have two people, usually, if it's a bigger plant. If you have an outside space you can do it in, that's probably advised just because you're going to get soil potentially everywhere. I mentioned earlier the pot size is going to be important. You want to have a pot 1 or 2 sizes up from your current pot. You want to water the tree either like a few hours minimum before you're going to repot it, or even a day or two, just so that soil is kind of damp. You don't want it to be dry because dry soil has really brittle roots in it, and you want to minimize again the damage to the roots as much as possible. So you want to have fresh soil for the new pot. I mentioned another person handy. So the question specifically asks about separating fiddle leaf fig. So here we have a fiddle leaf fig, and you can tell there's just about 1, maybe 2, 3 stems in here, but they all come from one plant. Okay, one main plant. Sometimes, depending on the grower or the store where you purchased your fig, it'll just be one trunk, basically one stalk. That's what they call a standard, a fiddle leaf fig standard tree. These guys are usually called a shrub or a bush because they've got more than one stalk. It's not really easy to separate those, so my advice would be don't. If you want a single, more tree-like fiddle leaf, just ask for it. There's growers that you can find anywhere with the single standard ones or the shrub-like ones. You can do it, and you can prune them too, but it's always going to want to be more bushy. But it's just going to probably be easier if you buy one that's grown to be a tree, if that's what you want, or grown to be a shrub, if that's what you want. So you can always, make cuttings. You can trim branches off the main stalk and propagate them in water if you want, and maybe make baby trees. It can take 2 or 3 months before they're rooted. Some might not root at all because they need super bright light. They need, lots of oxygen in the water. So you should change it weekly, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, I'm going off tangent here. So how do you repot it? Change it, outside, prepare for a mess, make sure that it's watered beforehand so that the soil is, and the roots are pliable. So again, with the pot, we talked earlier about, filling it about 1/3 of the way full. What that's going to do is give the roots something to grow into the new soil. So you don't want to just put it back, with the root ball down into the bare pot, because you might as well not repot it at all. And then, make that well with your hands, put the new root ball in, and then backfill it with soil just around the sides, and then water it in. Again, back to the ficus tree, this can do some damage and it will shock it. So it could potentially lose some leaves. It shouldn't die. if it's root bound, you'll want to try again that chopstick trick, to sort of loosen up the root ball. These are nice because they're slender, but they're strong. So you would just sort of go in and just lightly sort of poke in and then loosen up a bit, with trying to minimize the damage to the roots as much as possible. You're going to tear roots if it's root bound, and that's fine as long as you just tear less than you're sparing, I guess. So what you want is to have a loose, kind of a loose mass like that, but looser. And then you're going to put it back on top of that loose soil, the new loose soil. That's going to promote it to continue to grow and be happy and healthy until the next time you repot it in a year or so. Let's see, what's next? Any advice for someone who wants to grow more fruits, herbs, and vegetables, mainly in pots? This can be tough in Chicago. I would say move to Florida, move to California. Sort of kidding about that, but no, if you insist, you can give these plants a head start. If you're growing like hardy vegetables and stuff like tomatoes, corn, green beans, peppers, you can always give them a head start inside and start them in a greenhouse. Start them in a warmer environment. Otherwise, a lot of times you'll be buying the seed planted or the seed started plants from the big box stores, and sometimes they taste good, sometimes they don't, sometimes they live, sometimes they don't. You can always have a greenhouse all year inside that you can control the environment and grow things all year. There are several new, really nice indoor hydroponic systems that you can grow leafy greens and vegetables, produce inside in your kitchen. Like there's small ones for the kitchen windowsill. There's large ones where you can grow like a whole garden, basically all season or all year long inside. As far as fruit trees, like Meyer lemon trees and stuff like that, they're tough in this environment. The main problem is in the winter, it's very dry in our homes because we don't have, humidifiers going enough to keep the 70% humidity up. We don't have full sun for them, which is what most of those trees or plants need. So it can be tough unless you have a greenhouse. Let's see. Next question. How do you know if you're overwatering your plant? All right. This is probably going to be the last question I talk about, or the last topic I talk about before the Q&A opens up. But this is the most common way people hurt their plants is by overwatering. I mentioned briefly earlier that in our head, we associate caring for our plant to giving it water. And everybody kind of wants a schedule of when do I water my plant? Once a week, every 10 days. What is it? There's no schedule to water your plant. And the reason for that is a few different reasons. Your temperatures, everyone's temperature is a little bit different. Everyone's light is a little bit different. And the size of your pot and the amount of soil is different. So everyone's plant is going to dry at different rates. So if you want something to be on a schedule, make it a checking the plant, checking the soil. So if you want to check it weekly, once a week, go up to your plant, stick your finger down in the soil. This is a bad example because it's all rhizome. Stick your finger in the soil of the plant. If it's halfway down and you've made it halfway down and it's damp or moist, if you can feel moisture, it's not ready. If it's dry, then you can water it. If it's not dry, then it doesn't need a drink. Even if you see the top of the surface of the soil looks dry, that's fine. It should be. Most plants are going to prefer that you let them dry out rather than keep them wet. Root rot is caused by a bacteria that it flourishes in wet, soggy soils because there isn't enough oxygen getting to the root. And root rot is probably the number one killer of plants, root rot and pests. Hopefully somebody will ask about pests in the Q&A. But yes, so you should water your plant when it's dry. Now, 3 minutes or 4 minutes, it looks like, for the rest of this question. Here at the shop, we make custom soils for different plants and for different people. People that are compulsive overwaterers need a very chunky, fast draining soil mix. Certain plants need, more moisture retentive soil, and certain plants need less moisture retentive soil. So we have all these different soil amendments. These are pine bark. These are sometimes referred to as orchid bark. These are going to help create pockets of air so that in the midst of the soil, so the water can flow through. Now, again, it's always important to keep them in a pot with drainage because they need to drain out when you water it. We're not all perfect waterers. In fact, probably none of us are. But other amendments that you can add to your soil to make it even more fast draining are perlite. So this is the light, fluffy stuff that floats up to the surface sometimes when you water it. There's also pumice, which is heavier and won't float up, but it's a little harder to find. We do have it here at the shop. This is our house soil blend that we use. It's the aeroid mixed. A lot of the plants we sell are called aeroids. So this is a very chunky mixture of cocoa coir pith, cocoa coir croutons, sphagnum peat, and chunky perlite, and fine perlite, and a little bit of slow release fertilizer. And all of that together they all have their own purpose for the plant, but the main thing is that it replicates fairly closely the soil that they're used to growing in. So the sphagnum peat is going to have the decomposing element to it, to the organic matter that's fallen leaves and fallen branches. The cocoa coir pith is moisture retaining, but it also it won't hold too much moisture. And then obviously the chunky things, those are going to be the things that let the water flow through so that it's not sitting in a mud pie, basically. I think that covers everything about watering. Just know that it's always better to err on the side of less water than more water. One final question that I'm going to answer here before it's time for the Q&A. What is the best way to get rid of gnats on houseplants? This one is about fungus gnats. Fungus gnats come from, guess what, overwatering. That bacteria that grows in wet soil, so does fungus. That's fungus that these little gnats feed on. So the number one way to get rid of fungus gnats in your plants is to stop watering them. The number two thing that you should do to get rid of it once they're there is use these things called mosquito bits. You can buy them. They're in a little jug about like this. You can buy them at the hardware stores, Home Depots, online. You put them in your water that you're going to water the plant with, soak it at least overnight in that water. And then that's what you want to water all of your plants with for 2 weeks, all at the same time. So what that does is it contains a bacteria in it called Bacillus thuringiensis. That bacteria kills the larva of the fungus gnats, so that disrupts the life cycle. You also want to, if you can, hang those yellow sticky traps to catch the adults, so you can sort of monitor the infestation as it declines. But then stop watering your plants so much. It's not probably, they didn't come from you. A lot of times the plants you get at the store, they're overwatered, especially some of the stores that might not care as much about what their plants' needs are. Like, a big box store, for example, Walmart or something. They have some great plants, but sometimes they're not in the best condition. So I think that's it. Is it time for Q&A?
Let's do it. We have a lot of questions already submitted, but feel free to keep submitting them and we'll get to as many as we can. But our first couple of questions are actually the same, which is just if they have a plant and they want to take care of it to the best of their ability, but they don't even know what plant it is, how can they figure that out?
That's a tricky one. So a lot of people like these plant apps, these plant identifying apps. They're not all great. I'll say that much. My mom has this plant I gave her a couple of years ago, and she always forgets what it's called. So she always pulls out her plant app and takes a picture of it. And every time it tells her it's cannabis. And she laughs because she never remembers that it happened before, but I didn't give her a cannabis plant. So that's just an example of their inaccuracy. You can always snap a photo of your plant, and I don't know about other plant shops, but you can send it over to us you can shoot a text message to us at 312-882-8585, and we'll do our best to identify it. Sometimes those apps do work though. There's a lot of, I think Plant Snap or Plant ID is one that was fairly good. Yeah. And then once you know the name of it, then you can, research the care, or we'd be happy to tell you as well.
Awesome. Speaking of apps, we did actually have a question about them. If you've had any suggestions, I know you just mentioned one for any other phone apps or websites for just general plant tips.
I mean, not really, because like I kind of said, dabbled a little bit earlier about there's a lot of bad information online. But there's also a lot of good information. I would say just look at the source, cite if it's a retailer's website, see who they're citing for their sources. If it's a university or something like that, there's a good chance that the information is going to be accurate. But then at the same time, a lot of that information changes, classified, plants are reclassified from one thing to another. So I'd say just take it to somebody that knows. Take it to a plant shop. I know that we'd be happy to identify any plant for you as the best we can. Don't take it to a Walmart or a Kmart or a big box store, because they're not going to know. They're just an employee.
Our next question is, do you recommend worm castings for African violets?
Yeah, so you can use worm castings for African violets if you want. I know that there's a lot of specific nutrients out there for African violets in particular, and that's because a lot of people want them to bloom, more frequently, and they do have a more specific needs. And so I would suggest with those to go, if you want them to bloom regularly, to go with those specific ones for African violets. Let me see if the exact nutrients that they have in them is a higher amount of, I'm pretty sure it's nitrogen. Fertilizer is important. So yeah, it says a balanced fertilizer with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So I think it's just a higher level of it because of the flowering. So yeah, but you can use worm castings to supplement it, as well, because that's just a nice balanced, it's mainly nitrogen, but it's got the others in it as well.
Our next question is, are you familiar with clay watering spikes? And if so, what do you think about them?
I am familiar with them. If you're going to be gone for an extended time, then it can be fine to use. There's really no controlling it and the release rate. It's basically like a terracotta pot material, but you put water in it and then you stick the end down into the soil so it slowly leaches out into it. If in a pinch, yes, you can probably use them. Another thing that you can do is have somebody come in and check in on them, or water it, give it a good watering before you leave. That would be, 10, 14 days. If your plants are in a decent normal sized pot, they should be able to make it 10 or 14 days of you being gone without dying. You might want to set it in a tray with a little bit of extra water to suck up as it needs it, but I don't think there's really any need to buy those spikes.
Our next question is a little bit of a longer one. So we love plants, but have cats. And for fear of them eating possibly toxic plants, we currently don't have indoor plants. We're contemplating on putting plants anchored on the wall or way up on top shelves that they can't reach. Are there plants you recommend that would do well for those placements of the home, like smaller and doesn't require much watering, etc.?
Sure. So the first thing that I thought is you were going to ask for plants that were pet safe, which there are a number of them. In fact, let's see if I can flip the camera here. So these are some of our pet safe plants. These two shelves are a lot of peperomias. And then there's also Hoyas and some ferns and some calatheas. Those are all examples of completely pet safe plants. So there are a lot of variety of options out there for you. But if you think that your cat's just going to eat it and you don't want to have eaten plants anyway, then yeah, there's some pretty good options for mounting things. There are pots like, excuse me. Oh, sorry. Okay, so there are planters. Remember again, planters like these that can hang on the wall. Those are kind of cool. One thing to note is they do not have drainage in them, so you just want to be careful not to overwater. And then those as well. So those are a nice option sometimes to put things up and out of the way. And just want to make sure that the same things, you know, as a plant on a floor or on a shelf or on the wall, that they're getting the right amount of light, the right amount of, and the right temperature. So those are the important things.
Thank you.
Did I cover everything in that?
I think so. If there's any additional follow-up questions, feel free to submit them for whoever submitted that question. But our next question is about bromeliads. Should these be separated after the flower dies and there are shoots on the side of the plant?
So that's a good question. I am by no means a bromeliad expert, but I have dabbled with them. The general rule of thumb is that you let the pup mature by consuming. So the mother plant or the parent plant is going to turn entirely brown. And as it's dying, you know, from the bloom all the way down to the bottom, that pup or the pups around the sides are going to be using that energy from the mother plant. So it's acting as a host for them. So you don't really want to cut it off until it's all brown, they say. But I know that that's kind of unsightly in the home sometimes. So they're a very slow growing plant, which is probably why I'm not a big bromeliad fan. I like things that are kind of wild and fast growing. But yeah, you definitely want to leave it on as long as you can handle it.
Perfect. Do I need to add plant food in addition to water?
So we covered that a little bit. You definitely want to give most of your plants plant food, whether it's the worm castings or the fish fertilizer or both, or, you know, at the very worst case, you know, the over-the-counter stuff that you buy from the pre-made mixes. But if you're going to use that, definitely want to recommend using like 50% of what they recommend on the label, because some plants can take more and some plants can take less, but you want to be safe, not burn your plant.
I'm going to butcher this plant name in this question, but what do I do for a leaning plant, specifically a Dieffenbachia?
Sure. So a Dieffenbachia is going to lean as it gets bigger. Most plants are going to lean as they get larger, if a couple things aren't happening. With a Dieffenbachia, it's just a matter of weight. And a lot of times, you know, if you aren't rotating the pot as it's, you know, once a week or every couple of weeks, even once a month, it's going to lean towards the light. So if you don't have a light right above it providing the light, it's going to lean. Or even if you do, it's going to be still just top heavy. A couple of things you can do. You can prop it up with a bamboo pole. You can use a moss pole. You'll see behind me here, a lot of the plants up there are on moss poles. That's sometimes for support. It's sometimes for climbing. You know, a lot of those are climbing plants. Just stick it as deep in the soil as you can and give it a strong structure to hold it up. If you can't get it deep enough, then you may need to repot it into a larger pot that can support the top heavy weight. Worst case scenario, you can stick a pot in a pot and then stick the pole in between them so that it can sort of support that pole does that make sense? So yes, there's a lot of options for a leaning plant. And if it's an important plant to you, then I would say the worst option would be to cut it back and let it start fresh. So.
Perfect. The next question is about a Christmas cactus. They said they moved to Florida 5 years ago, and it's the Christmas cactus has been outside, and it was thriving, but now one of them is turning red and droopy, and the larger one is getting dark and drooping. I was wondering if you had any insight as to what might be going on.
Christmas cactuses are fun. They do often turn colors from sun stress, and often the new growth of them comes out a little bit with a reddish tint. I don't think we've got any nearby right now, but I would say check the water. They want to stay, consistently moist, but not wet. So hopefully it's in a pot with drainage. Are you giving it nutrients? If not, you should. Does it have pests? A lot of time plants outside do get pests, and that can be an issue. Christmas cactuses are especially prone to the spider mites, and they definitely have gotten mealies before, mealy bugs, that is. So check those things out. Maybe it might be in direct sun. That's probably going to turn it red. Drooping is usually a sign of either overwatering or underwatering. So that's why I would say check the soil, check to make sure it's in a pot with drainage.
Perfect. Our next question is just if you could repeat the name of the product that you talked about that goes in water to kill bugs.
Sure. It is called Mosquito Bits, BITS. And it is, let me go grab it real quick so you can see what it looks like. So this is what it looks like. And they're just little granules, and you just put them into the water you're going to use to water your plants. Oops. And that's it. Soak it at least, overnight, preferably 24 hours. There we go. The active ingredient is called Bacillus thuringiensis. You're probably not gonna be able to see it, but that's a bacteria that kills the mosquitoes, or the larvae of mosquitoes, fungus gnats, and a few other little flying pesky pests.
The next question, I have a fig tree that looks like it's thinning. It's been in the same location. I water it weekly. Do you think it needs more light or less water?
Less water. So back to the watering on a schedule. If you're watering it weekly after checking the soil and it's, the top 2, 3, 4 inches of it are dry, you're fine. What did you say the window was? Did they say it's in a west window? Or?
She didn't say. She just said it's
Okay.
in the same location.
Same location. So if it's thinning, yeah, you're probably watering it a little too much. You may want to consider fertilizing it if you aren't already, because again, trees they're big, so they need a lot more food than many other plants. It would take as much light as you can give it as well. So it could be both.
Well, I do know we're getting close to that 7 o'clock mark. So for those of you that have to hop out, I want to say thank you so much for joining us. And also obviously thank you to Jeff. But Jeff, I want to give you a chance to give a quick plug for your shop before the people.
Sure. Thank you. So we're located in Chicago at 3907 North Damon. We're open every day except Mondays and Tuesdays right now. And as I mentioned earlier, we're happy to help with plant education, plant care tips. You can text us pictures of your plant, even if it's a spot on a leaf or something. Just shoot a text over to 312-882-8585, and we'll respond as soon as we can. We have basically all the products that I mentioned today available for sale in the shop. Plus, we have, I think, right around 1,100 plants in the store right now. Probably 500 or 600 different varieties. So if you have a chance, hopefully, and you're in the area, you can come out and see us. I'm here almost every day as well. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you all for participating in this. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. And do you have time to stay on for a couple more questions?
Sure.
Again, thank you for everyone that did attend if you have to hop off. But if you want to stick around, we're going to answer just a few more questions. What is the best way to prune a plant?
Good question. So that's going to depend on the plant a lot. But a lot of times, if it's a tree, you're just going to want to shape it to what you like, what the look that you like is. So if you're going to cut off horizontal branches to make it more tree-like, so taller and more, just more of a trunk, and you want to cut it as close to the base or as close to the trunk as possible. You don't want to cut it out here where there's not going to be any new growth, coming out. It's going to look silly. As far as other types of plants, pruning is sort of a thing that's discretionary. You know, it's not a necessity, but a lot of people like to do it just to keep them maintained. So this is a Pothos, one of the ones we mentioned earlier. This is one of the easiest growing plants. You would have to trim it between the node. So this is where a node is, where the leaf comes out. It's a raised part on the stem. And there's aerial roots that are starting to come out in those spots. So just trim it anywhere between those. Most of the time you'd want to trim it at the base of the stem, closest to the node. That way you're going to have new growth come out right there. And then when you've trimmed it, you can just take this piece and put it in a glass of water. It's going to grow roots in a few weeks. And then once those roots are 2 or 3 inches long, you can plop that right back in the same pot in the soil if you want. And then it's filling up making a fuller plant for you.
Perfect. We do have a couple of questions about orchid blooms, and if you have any advice on how to get them to bloom if they're not, or get them to bloom more often.
That's tricky. There's a lot of varieties of orchid, and a lot of them are only going to bloom once or twice a year if you're lucky. And those are in ideal circumstances. So your most common orchid are like your Phalaenopsis, the kind that you see at the grocery stores and plant shops all over. They're really pretty. They're full of blooms. They can bloom for months at a time, or they can, bloom for a few days. This is a different variety of orchid right here. This is a giant thing. It's I don't even remember the name of it, the type of it, but I bought it as a gift to myself. It was so fragrant. The entire shop smelled fragrant for like 3 weeks as it bloomed. That one I'm still trying to get to rebloom. So I don't know if I'm the expert on orchids by any means, but the ideal conditions for an orchid are medium to bright, probably more on the bright side, indirect light and high humidity, regular feeding, regular nutrients. And then once it's done blooming, the last bloom, you can see none of these really have the old dead stem. This one's got it, but just still green. Let's see if you can see this here. So you want to cut it back when it's done blooming down to the last healthy piece of stem, because there's a good chance that might be where the next blooms come from. Let's see if I can find one. I feel like I'm killing time because this isn't a very good answer, but it's hard. Orchids are hard unless you're have a greenhouse. So you can see on this one, it's green, it's flexible. This one is probably likely to rebloom off of here. Oh, yeah, look. Can you see this? Tip here is some new growth coming out. So this one may rebloom shortly. It's also got some floppy leaves, which means it's a little thirsty. So I'll give it a drink. But regular nutrients, that's an important thing too for orchids to stay healthy.
Hopefully a simpler question, but does water temperature matter at all when you're watering your plants?
It does, but it doesn't have to be an exact science. So they're never going to experience scalding hot water in their native environment, nor are they going to ever experience ice cold water. So I always, just a general rule of thumb is use room temperature or like lukewarm water.
Perfect. This will be our last question of the evening, but just a general question about air plants. Can you talk about just some general care for them from watering to fertilizing?
So I don't carry air plants in the store because they're so high maintenance. They need like misted with a fine mist spray bottle every day. And then on top of that, they need drenched in a bowl of water once a week in order to stay alive. Other than that, they're cool. I don't think they should be called air plants. I think they should be called mist and water plants. But that's what they need. And I don't have time for that with all these plants. So it's hard enough sometimes to keep up with the regular tropical plants. But I think I've had one in my life, one air plant, and that was it. I'm sorry.
No worries. I watched someone's air plant for them one time, and it was a lot of pressure. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah. Yeah.
So kudos to any of you that can keep them alive.
For sure.
Thank you again so much. We've gotten so much positive feedback in the chat as well about everyone enjoying this event tonight and learning a little bit more about how to care for their plants. Maybe I can finally keep something alive other than a succulent. But thank you so much, Jeff. And thank you to all of our alumni who attended this evening. I hope you all have a great rest of your night.
was my pleasure. Thank you guys all very much as well.